My name is Tom Kirsch, and I'm from the C.G. Jung Institute in San Francisco. This is an interview with Dr. Joseph Henderson at his home in Ross, California, just north of San Francisco. I have known Dr. Henderson first as an analyst, then teacher, colleague, and now as friend. Dr. Henderson first met Jung in 1929 when he went to Zurich for a year of analysis. He decided to become an analyst, studied medicine in London, and got his degree in 1938. He returned to the United States, eventually ending up in San Francisco, where he was a co-founder of the San Francisco Institute. His first publication was as a co-author with Jung in Man and His Symbols. He was the only non-Swiss author and wrote a chapter, Ancient Myths and Modern Man. That was followed shortly thereafter by his first book on initiation, The Wisdom of the Serpent, with Maud Oakes. Following that, in 1967, he completed 30 years of research on the subject of initiation and published Thresholds of Initiation. One of his other major interests has been the archetype of culture, and this eventuated in his book Cultural Attitudes in Perspective, published in 1983. The date of the interview was May 1977 in the backyard of Dr. Henderson's home. Joe, one of the things that interested me is how did you first hear about Jung? I mean, what was the first, your first contact?
Well, I heard about Jung mainly from Dr. Elizabeth Whitney and Dr. Godwin Baynes here in California. Mm-hmm. Dr. Baynes was Jung's assistant at that time, and he spent a year in California, partly between Berkeley and partly in Carmel. And I had a few sessions with Dr. Whitney, and she suggested I speak to Dr. Baynes. And he said, "What are you doing out here on the West Coast? Why don't you go back to Europe, where you really belong? And if you want analysis, why don't you go to Jung?" And I said that would be impossible. I had no money. And he said, "Well, you'll find the way." So I taught school for a year to make the money to go to Jung. So he accepted me, and I went the autumn of 1929. There was quite a colony of Americans in Zurich at that time, and a combination of Americans and English. Barbara Hanna was my contemporary. We were psychological babies at the same time, as she used to say, and we had quite a lively group, all living at a pension called the Pension Neptune in Zurich, and we got a little too groupy, and I left and went up to the Waldhaus Dolder, where I thought I would be more alone with the unconscious, and stayed there for about a year. After that year, I went to England to study medicine.
Was that a result of kind of your analytic work at the time that you decided?
Yes, I had no idea of becoming an analyst or a psychologist when I went to Jung, but I was already somewhat indoctrinated, and during the course of my personal analysis with Jung, dreams came through that seemed to talk about medicine, psychology, hermetic philosophy, I don't know what all. And the result was that at the end of the year, it seemed that I should go to explore the possibility of medical school.
How was that in the 30s to be in Zurich at that time?
Well, it was a very remarkable experience because it was such an odd collection of people that were all gathered there, of all ages and all backgrounds, and all in a very peculiar state of mind. They were what I later describe in my studies of initiation. They were all in a state of transition. You know, Van Gennep talks about the 3 stages of initiation as preliminal, liminal, and postliminal. Most of us were in a either preliminal or liminal stage, which meant absolutely nowhere as far as outward shape is concerned. The liminal stage of initiation is like any transitional stage in life, either in group or as an individual, or even in the animal world. It's like the stage where a caterpillar is in its chrysalis becoming a moth or a butterfly. It is, in a sense, dissolved. Its former shape has, in a sense, dissolved, and it is in a state of metamorphosis. Transformation or metamorphosis are the words that are usually used to describe that stage. Well, if you get a group of people who are all in that stage together, you get very odd things going on. And Jung determined to mobilize this somewhat and try to give it a shape by having us all attend a seminar. There was no institute in those days, and he had us all attend his so-called English seminar on Wednesday mornings at what is now the Zurich Institute.
How did that English seminar begin?
It began in 1925 when a group of psychologists and analysts asked Jung if he would describe to them his experience of Freud and his break with Freud. That was ended with the 1925 seminar notes, which are available, and it was a very free and open description of his whole personal and impersonal experience of Freud and his break with Freud and the discovery of his own psychological principles. The next series began in 1928, the year before the term before I came there, and Jung had decided to take a series of dreams by a man patient and analyze them in detail in a seminar situation. And it was about a group of about 35 or 40 people altogether, and we met every Wednesday for this seminar.
Well, you were still a very young man at the time, and how did you feel being with this mixed group of...
Well, I felt bewildered and fascinated, and Jung, of course, was marvelous the way he talked in his seminars, but to make a relation to the people was a rather difficult matter. I was friendly with 1 or 2 of them, but for the most part, they were, as I say, in this rather strange state of transition, whereby one couldn't really see what they were like. There was a famous actress came there during that year, and Jung allowed her to come to sit in on the seminar, and her description of it was quite fascinating. She was a woman with a very powerful persona. Not only was she an actress, she was also a very social person from New York, and she had a really cast-iron persona. And she looked around the room and saw all these people in this stage of transition, and her comment was, well, Jung was marvelous, but those peculiar people that are surround him, it's really disgraceful. Why doesn't he attract the kind of people that are worthy of him? That's how he looked to someone from outside. But during the course of this seminar, we all had our subjective reactions, and this was what Jung, I think, found so helpful, was that things happened to us in our analysis that would not have happened otherwise if we hadn't been in the seminar. And one of them was that happened to me was the dream I had. I dreamt that Jung was a Protestant clergyman standing at a pulpit giving a sermon, and we were all in the pews, and when he finished his sermon, all the others got up and began to chant mandala, mandala, the way they might in Christian times have said Hosanna. And this represented a worshipful attitude to Jung that was laughable, as you can imagine. And so it seemed to me to say, well, that's what you really think of this seminar of Jung. He's nothing but a like a Protestant clergyman, and they are all just sheep following the master. So I thought, I hate to tell Jung this dream, but I did. And he said, well, of course you should feel that way. You should dream. You should have that dream. You're a young man, only 26 or so, and most of these people are in the second half of life, and to you they must look rather ancient, and so they were in a different kind of experience from the one that you're in. So, and if you feel the way the dream says, you should certainly feel free not to come to the seminar or to make it anything you like. And then I realized that I was absolutely fascinated with this seminar, that it was an experience I wouldn't have missed for anything in the world. I was not at all inhibited by it. To see Jung personally in that situation was absolutely wonderful. It was like sitting at the foot of a great teacher, like something like a kind of Socratic experience. And the idea that I should have a dream that he was nothing but a Protestant clergyman struck me as too funny. Well, then, of course, I saw the whole thing was a projection, my projection. I was simply projecting my own Protestant background, making Jung a father figure, making the other people into a group, which they were not. None of these people had any group feeling whatsoever. They all mistrusted each other. They sat in their little chairs, looking hardly from side to side, and then they immediately got up and left, and at the end, without saying goodbye to anyone, it was a group of very isolated people. And so I saw my projection. As a result of that, though, interesting things happened to other people, and one of them was that in interpreting one of the dreams of this man, Jung said, it seems to me the dream is trying to tell this man that he doesn't have enough communal feeling, group feeling. There was a dream of a table with chairs all turned away from the table instead of towards the table. Well, we ended the seminar on that note, and there was an Australian woman doctor, an old woman who was kind of like a medicine man, a medicine woman, and she had dreams that night wrestling with this problem and told them to Jung. And the next seminar, Jung said, now Dr. Shaw has been our medium for this occasion, and she feels that it's terribly important for us to learn how to relate to each other because we have been too isolated. And this dream brings it all out into the open. It was one of those synchronistic experiences that we should pay attention to. Whereupon everybody began whispering to each other and looking around and beginning to communicate for the first time. And the question then was, what should we do about it? It was decided that at the end of the first hour of the seminar, we would have tea and open sandwiches in one of the other rooms for 10 minutes, and then come back for the second hour of the seminar. That was as far as we were able to go in socializing at that time. It was usually during the second seminar that, the second hour of the seminar, that Jung really opened up and talked from himself. After he had asked enough questions and got enough answers, and we had gone over the dreams and wrestled with certain problems, he would suddenly stop and then just talk from himself about whatever the subject of that particular seminar happened to be. It was nothing rehearsed, nothing decided in any way, nothing worked out at all. In fact, there was not even any recording of these except by hand. Mary Foote and a helper, for an English woman, took longhand notes for years before we got a stenographer to take shorthand. And Jung did not want these seminars to be propagated, to be passed around, because he wanted to keep away from anything suggesting dogma and allow himself perfect freedom. And he was very open and very free.
I wonder, in medical school, were you in England at the time that he gave the those Tavistock lectures?
Yes, I was a medical student at that time, and I was living fairly near the Tavistock Clinic where these lectures were given, and I was allowed to attend them.
Was that a very different kind of experience than those small seminars?
Oh, totally different. That was, there Jung was really on stage and very uncomfortable to begin with, because he expected to be criticized, which indeed he was. It was a highly critical, very rational, very psychoanalytically oriented group. And he knew that he was going to have trouble with some of them. Some were his friends, but a good many of them hardly knew him.
I wondered also, is it out of those early seminars and out of your own analysis that you developed your interest in initiation?
Well, I would say out of my own personal analysis mainly, and out of that experience somewhat. As I said, this liminal stage of initiation was suggested to me by the kind of experience that I and many other people were having in analysis, where we were going through a transitional stage where we didn't know whether we were fish, flesh, or fowl, and we had to find ourselves anew. We had, so to speak, separated from our former personas and were not yet crystallized into the kind of person that we would later become. And this gave me the model for exactly what I then discovered takes place in initiation rites the world over. So I began a study of initiation as an archetype. Jung spoke of it as an archetype, meaning something that takes many forms, but in its basic content is always the same. A separation leading to a kind of death, leading to a rebirth or a sense of renewal, which in turn leads to a kind of experience that the initiation rites speak of as incorporation. In psychological terms, it means what we would call integration. Integration of the Personality was a book that Jung wrote shortly after that time and expressed the common feeling that many people had, that they were discovering how to reintegrate the personality after an analytical experience.
You must have studied then a lot of anthropology as part of...
Well, I studied anthropology, and but I chiefly studied the Greek scholars in Cambridge. My father-in-law, Professor Cornford, was a Greek scholar, a scholar of Greek philosophy, and a follower strongly influenced by Jane Harrison, who wrote Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religions, and Themis. Themis was a key work because it described a typical initiation ceremony in ancient Greece, which no one had recognized but Jane Harrison, who came across it by chance. And by learning to interpret this, she was able to create the whole model of initiation, but seen through Greek eyes. So I studied, but I studied anthropology too, and had the opportunity to do a little field trip in New Mexico and Arizona one summer during my medical years to study the Hopi Indians and the Zuni. I went to the Hopi snake dance, and that, of course, was made a very profound impression on me because I saw there an initiation rite in action. Well, the thing that I think of chiefly now is how little we really knew of the worldwide distribution of these patterns of initiation as well as of other cultural patterns. We have learned a great deal since then. It was the anthropology was still kind of stuck in the Golden Bough and Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific and works of that kind. And the whole of anthropology has since opened out into the most marvelous array of studies by the social anthropologists and Levi-Strauss and the cultural anthropologists in America. The whole study of linguistics has thrown a totally new light on everything. None of this was known at that time. We were working in the dark, really, from an anthropological point of view. So it took me a good many years to write the book that I didn't publish until 1967. That took that long for this research to gel.
I guess I'm interested in how strong the American Indian influence has been in your own thinking and your own work.
Well, the American Indian became a symbol for me that I was surprised to find in Zurich. I never paid much attention to Indians in my early life. I was born in Indian country, really, in Nevada. There were Indians. There was an Indian village just outside our town. And I had a kind of old Indian who used to look after me as a boy, and I just thought of Indians as part of the landscape. But in Zurich, I had dreams of Indians, and the Indian came to symbolize to me my American identity as distinct from my European identity. Living in Europe, I was in danger of becoming too European for my own good. And the Indian kept coming into my dreams to remind me that I was American, basically, and that there is a real difference between the American psyche and the European psyche. And that was always carried by the Indian.
Would you say that kind of thinking was prominent in your deciding to return to the United States rather than maybe staying in England?
Yes, I certainly, having lived there for 9 years, I was so comfortable there, I could easily have stayed. I understand why people, Americans, would like to live in Europe. Life in many ways is much easier, much more human, much more, one feels much more in connection somehow with one's fellow man. The longer you live in Europe, the more you feel a part of the group. of a circle to which you belong, there's still a good many wide open spaces in America where people fail to communicate, to relate to each other, to say nothing of the violence of America, and you feel that that is present in Europe, but only in certain pockets where you can avoid it. So it's a great temptation for the American to think that perhaps life would be much nicer. But I had the feeling that I would never be a European. I would always, whatever I said would always be divided in two by the fact that I was American. And therefore I would lose a certain identity by not coming back and living in my own country. Also, perhaps the Indian would be offended.
Do you feel that you've integrated the Indian into your own life at the present time?
Well, I suppose as much as it's possible to do so, but I think that it's perhaps not to be entirely integrated. It's probably something that defines the way we really are, and therefore it always remains a little bit detached from the rest of us. It accounts for a certain difference in the American psyche from that of the European psyche.
You say somehow that we can't really completely integrate, or that the Indian, I wonder if that's, as an American, do you think that's specific to the Indian, or do you think that is so with other symbols too?
The Indian, Jung described as the symbolic figure that he felt expressed the deepest level of the American psyche.
Is it because of the depth of the experience, or the depth of the symbolism of the Indian, that we, as Americans, can't completely integrate it, or is...
Well, it's just a fact that the Indians were here for thousands of years and are, in a way, a part of the landscape. They, or were. They really lived solely and entirely on the, in relation to this country, lived in certain places and made their cultures there. This is not true of us. We brought our culture with us largely from Europe or from other parts of the world. And therefore there's a certain cultural split between our European culture pattern and the fact that we live in the same country as the Indians. Therefore, the Indian carries the meaning of that longing for union with the landscape. That's one way of putting it. Can we ever be as close to the American landscape as the Indian? The answer is no, because he was here first.
I was wondering too if there's some connection between our Indian heritage, so to speak, and our fascination maybe for some of the Eastern people, since the Indians originally came from across the Bering Straits.
Yes, I think that we must feel that below the surface of the American Indian culture, there are strong ties with Siberia, with China, with possibly the whole of the Far East. That's not racial, that's cultural. The term racial, incidentally, is a very bad word in Jungian circles because it implies that there might be a difference in the unconscious between the black and the yellow and the white and the red peoples. There is no difference in the unconscious. The collective unconscious is the same for everyone. There are only differences of culture pattern that certain groups brought with them from where they originally came, and it does appear as if the so-called Red Indian brought with him certain patterns from Asia that have become acclimatized in this country. So in recent years, all my work has been to try to define what we mean by culture and to try to clear the way for us to understand psychologically how culture arises and what it means and what forms it takes, so as not to confuse it with individual psychology. And there's a tendency among Jungians as well as other psychologists to confuse culture patterns with psychological patterns. Psychological patterns are not the same as culture patterns.
Could you try and describe some of the differences? Because it seems to me that we use culture patterns all the time in analysis, and we don't recognize that we do that.
This goes back to my experience in Zurich, too, because I noticed that among these people who were there for analysis, many of them had cultural alignments that were very different from each other. And they tended to project into analysis what they expected to find rather than what was actually there. And what they expected to find was whatever cultural pattern they favored. In other words, if they were favoring a religious attitude, they tended to find religion in it. If they favored social betterment or attitudes, political attitudes, they hoped to find that. If it was aesthetic, they expected to find it as if it were like works of art. If it were, if they were philosophical, they tried to make psychology into a philosophy. They're still doing that, by the way. Quite a number of very intelligent and interested students of philosophy are intrigued by psychology and feel that it should be given a place in the philosophical scheme of things. And this is valuable up to a point, but it can also falsify something of the psychology that Jung created.
Well, how would you differentiate, let's say, these cultural attitudes?
Well, I described what I felt to be what I felt I had observed, which was that people who are in any way individual and are culturally alive to one or two, or perhaps three, cultural modes: the religious, the philosophic, the aesthetic, and the social. There are all sorts of combinations of these. And Jung, for instance, was predominantly oriented to the religious. His religious attitude was the fundamental one, as he describes in his Dreams, Memories, and Reflections. The aesthetic attitude may be found in anyone, quite regardless of whether they are artists or not. Religious attitude may be found in people who are not formally religious at all. They may never go to church or anything, but they are basically oriented to the religious way of looking at things. And the philosophical attitude is often found in people who have no formal education in philosophy at all, but they tend to look at life in a philosophical way. Those are the things that I approached culture empirically.
The culture attitudes can be developed in analysis, then. That could be one of the main functions.
Well, a lot of what we talk about is cultural attitudes in analysis. That's why I thought it was important to bring it up. If you have a person with a strong religious attitude, the character of his analysis is going to be rather different from the person who has, say, a philosophic or a social or an aesthetic attitude. But that doesn't mean that you analyze the attitude. You merely point out that there is an attitude and that it has its own life to be encouraged but also criticized if it gets in the way of psychological development. So the usefulness of these categories to me is to show their value, but also their danger of getting in the way of individual psychological development, because it's so easy for people to adopt a cultural attitude that they think is individual when really it's collective.
If we think of Jung, would you say that which of his attitudes would you say were most developed for him?
The religious and the philosophical. He certainly had developed an aesthetic attitude, but he mistrusted it. He had a very sure sense of what aesthetics was all about, and his own work as a creative artist shows that he had a very definite aesthetic sensibility. But he saw it as an obstacle to individual development. He saw it as a way that people often tend to objectify their lives instead of really living them.
Through aesthetics.
Yes. They objectify themselves as though they were looking at themselves as an object instead of really participating fully in life. And that's why he tended to mistrust it. But I think his weakest attitude was the social attitude.
What would you describe are your own strongest attitudes?
Well, I think originally it was an aesthetic attitude, and later it became more a philosophic attitude. And the big thing that happened in my analysis was the discovery of a religious attitude. Social attitude is probably at the bottom of the list.
I wondered if your views on transference are quite similar to Jung's, or where they, in some ways, have moved in other directions, or would you care to comment on that in any way?
Well, I wrote a paper which was delivered in Zurich at an international congress for psychotherapy called Resolution of the Transference in the Light of C.G. Jung's Psychology. And that was that Congress was the first time that any of us had talked publicly about Jung's use of the word transference. Up to that time, transference had been understood purely in the Freudian sense, the old psychoanalytic sense. A transference is something to live through and break, get rid of, move on, get back to life again without it. Without having done its work, it is like a shell that should be cast aside, as though it had no further meaning. It seemed to me and to others at that time that Jung's psychology had a rather different viewpoint, and Jung himself acknowledged that the transference in itself has a certain archetypal content that you can't merely dismiss and feel should be discarded once the initial projections are withdrawn. However, he did consider that it should be ultimately resolved so that it is no longer fixed upon the person of the therapist, but should move on. And it was his understanding that of the archetypal content of the transference that made this possible. That gives rise to to two rather different ideas about the transference. One is that you just live with it, you don't resolve it, that it just goes on, and some people believe that that's what a Jungian transference really is.
That it goes into the sunset?
Yes. I believe it can be and should be resolved. But I don't think that it should be done artificially. I think it has to be done only by a process of development in time. The thing that I did say was that the transference is resolved by the establishment of what I call a symbolic friendship, meaning that when the transference is resolved, there is a feeling of friendship rather than of mutual projection between the therapist and his analysant or patient. But it is not the same as an ordinary friendship, and it can never be the same as quite as an ordinary friendship, because it started in the analytical situation, which was artificial. So it always has something of that quality of its origin, but that gives it its symbolic meaning. And I felt that the best way to describe that was to say that it feels as if in that personal transference there was something symbolic that carries through, and it makes that relationship especially meaningful and somewhat different from others.
Joe, I wanted to ask, could you talk about any of your own encounters with Jung's shadow?
In your relationship with him?
Well, the word Jung's shadow always strikes me as rather the wrong way to approach what I think is meant by that question. Nobody was more conscious of his shadow than Jung, or of the people around him, that he had faults, some of which people minded and others liked. Such as came out in one of the interviews that he was a backseat driver. Well, he would be, because he is a Leo type, and they're all, that is, his sun sign is Leo, and he was a very marked example of somebody who has to lead, who tends to lead. And they tend to be at a disadvantage when they're in the back seat, when they can't lead. I don't call that shadow. I just think it's a kind of personality thing. The loss of temper also is often associated with people of that type, and the thing they say about it is that it doesn't do them any good to lose their temper. They just lose it again the same way as they did before. It isn't something that they necessarily can correct, although they work at it. Jung has said himself that he worked at trying to be more, wait longer before reacting to some things that disturbed him, because he did have a tendency to fly off the handle. He had done, I think, quite a lot in the direction of correcting that. His shadow was, I'm sure, terrifically strong in those years when he was working through his unconscious material, and I think it shows in some of his relations to Freud that there was a power that he didn't know he had, and it must have registered itself with Freud and with other people in the Psychoanalytic Institute as a power drive. But I never saw any of that in Jung himself. He was the most reasonable man I've ever known. And whatever he did that was out of line, he was always willing to reconsider what he had said that disturbed anyone, and it did it with great interest.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have any personal encounters with him where he hurt you or disappointed you or made you upset you because of differences?
No, I wouldn't say that I ever did. I described in a little thing I wrote called Contact with Jung, I described a party at his house one night where I felt the shadow got loose. Everybody was forced to play a game that with Jung at the center of it, where they threw a knotted towel from one person to another around a circle, and whoever caught the towel was it. I mean, where for the or the other, I forgot just how it worked, but they Jung kept this thing going almost beyond endurance, and I fell down and broke my glasses, and somebody else skinned a knee, and at the end of the party we were all in shambles, but this was characteristic of Jung's intolerance of persona. He was so afraid that the party would stick on a polite persona level that he engineered it to bring out the shadow. And in the end, we all had a marvelous time. We all got drunk, and it was it ended very happily. He was like a force of nature.
You use the word that Jung was very mediumistic, and I wonder if you could make some comments about the memories, dreams, and reflections as kind of in terms of that kind of quality of Jung, that parapsychological sense that he seems to have had.
Well, one felt it about him that he that he was picking up information that ordinary people don't pick up. Mediumistic is too grandiose a word for what he was doing. In a way, it was almost as though it was simply another sense. So a kind of at times it could seem a bit uncanny. He had very small eyes, and when he looked through those little eyes, well, usually over the top of his eyeglasses, you knew that he was looking at something that you couldn't see. And what came out was usually some very simple fact. It wasn't any aura or any great message that came back from the beyond. It was something about your ordinary life or the ordinary situation. And these things interested him enormously, and apparently he functioned very similar to the shaman or medicine man in that respect. I remember him saying once that there was a woman had come to him, and he didn't know what the trouble was. All he knew was that he was sick at his stomach afterwards, and he knew that something was up. Some parapsychological phenomenon was at work in this woman that he couldn't understand. And then came someone else, and he put two and two together. What that person told him and what the woman told him fitted into the same story of a haunting, a ghost phenomenon. And he knew who was at the bottom of it all. Some old grandmother in Germany was at the bottom of the whole plot, or whatever it was that was going on. And he said, I had to consider whether my treatment of these people would result in her death. And he took that just simply as a matter of fact.
Joe, do you think when you're doing psychotherapy sometimes that that's art for you?
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Mm-hmm. When so many hours, I have no idea how they're going to turn out, and I have to risk everything and hope that the truth will come out somehow. It's got to be art. It's not science. It's not.
That's a good definition of art. It's got to come out somehow.
Is it technique?
It's not a technique. It's a. It may be. It may have technical things in it, but it's not a technique.
Did you ever hear directly from Jung about his years with Freud and what was involved in the break?
Oh yes, he talked about that quite.
Was he preoccupied with it?
At times he was, and I used to get rather tired of it. Because I wish he'd stop talking about Freud because I didn't want to hear any more about it. And I agreed with what he'd already said. It did preoccupy him sometimes more than I thought it should. I thought
it was something he was still working on?
Still somewhat preoccupied with. But I was reconciled to it by having lunch with him and Emma Jung once, and they talked very openly about it in such a human way that I thought, well, these people were really hurt, and it's a hurt that cannot be healed. There could never be a true, quite healing of that breach. They had put something very genuine into that relationship with Freud, and for it to have been rejected was a really hurtful thing.
Permanent wound.
Mm-hmm.
What is your own understanding of what that was about?
Well, I think they belong to two different sides of the mountain. To me, Freud was of the 19th century and Jung was of the 20th century, and there was a watershed between them, and they simply couldn't meet. The water went down on both sides, but it couldn't go over the top. Freud's education was all scientific. It was based upon the absolute validity of zoological observation. You observe something, you put it down, and you know what it is, and you get enough facts together, and then you make a hypothesis, and then you subject that to further testing, and then you get to the truth. That was his basic method that he loved, and that was his whole identity as in spite of the fact that he deviated from that very considerably in his later works. That was still his basic commitment. Whereas Jung was already over on the other side of the watershed into philosophy and anthropology and comparative religion and science. He was already in the world of Bergson and Einstein and Whitehead and the post-Nietzschean world. And so I think they couldn't meet culturally because of that. And then their ages. You see, Freud was
19 years old?
Nearly 20 years older. And it's only natural they couldn't speak quite the same language. It's remarkable they could talk to each other at all with their different backgrounds and their different nationalities and their different ways of looking at things. The fact that they did shows that there was something bigger than both of them that brought them together, inevitably.
What do you think of Jungian psychology as a popular movement, or would you work to spread the word, to enlighten the masses?
No, certainly not. Proselytizing was the farthest thing from my mind, is the farthest thing from my mind that you could possibly do with psychology, any form of psychology. And Jung was certainly of that opinion. He used to say in the seminar, don't missionarize. In other words, don't go out and tell people how wonderful it is. He said, it's for you, it's not for them. So presumably it's for anyone who wants it, but not something to be handed out unless they do.
Have you thought about the future of analytical psychology and what it might become, what it might mean culturally?
Well, I've thought that it can become much more a critical method of understanding the culture apart from the individual. I think that many people would do well to understand their culture better than they do, the culture in which they were born much better than they do, and a lot of their problems would vanish if they did. I mean, a lot of what seems like an individual or personal neurosis is really a cultural problem. It's something that they were that they're unaware of. They're unconscious of it, just the same as they would be if it's a personal problem. But what solves it is not the personal, but the cultural change that is made. And they, for instance, among the Hopi Indians, or the Cochiti, I guess it is, there's a description of how a neurosis in or psychosis in a patient can be treated by two different ways depending on the diagnosis, whether or not the patient is suffering from a psychosocial problem or whether she is the victim of witchcraft. And if she's the victim of witchcraft, then the shaman has to appeal to the collective unconscious and come up with a picture or a representation of the witch, if possible, the witch himself or herself, and kill it and get rid of it. And that's a real picture of a battle with archetypal forces. But if it's decided that this woman is neurotic because her matrilineage has been disturbed in some way, her mother died and then her sister died and she's left alone with a child and no brother to look after it, then she's disturbed by her psychosocial position. And she is treated accordingly. She is given new mothers and new children to look after, and her matrilineage is built up, and she becomes well. We could do a lot for people by understanding their social dislocations, their cultural dislocations. That's what I mean by the direct experience with the archetypal world, and that is quite different from the psychosocial dimension, and it's also different from the purely personal dimension of life. It's a man in relation to the pure archetype, and that's, of course, something that Jung stands for in psychology more than anything else, I guess. And that's the thing that gives people a great deal of trouble to understand and to work with, because it is such a scary place and can unleash such forces that have no social sanction. So the person is alone with them. But Jung was not afraid of that, and that's why I think he is such a monument to our work.